The Final Fantasy franchise has been reinventing itself for nearly 4 decades, and every single mainline game tells a completely different story. That's 16 worlds, 16 combat systems, and 16 very different ways to save the planet. So today, I'm breaking down every mainline Final Fantasy game and everything you need to know about them, starting with the one that almost never existed, Final Fantasy 1. In 1987, Square was broke. Not struggling quarter broke. One more flop and we shut the doors broke. So they poured everything into a single RPG and called it Final Fantasy, because that's literally what it was. Their final shot, you play as 4 Warriors of Light, picking classes like Black Mage, White Mage, and Red Mage before diving into turn-based combat that would become the blueprint for every JRPG that followed. The magic system, the party composition, the crystal-driven quest structure. This game invented all of it, but here's the kicker. The story has a time loop twist. Your heroes defeat the final boss, Chaos, only to realize they traveled 2,000 years into the past and created the very threat they just destroyed. For an 8-bit NES game, that's surprisingly sophisticated. It worked. The game sold over 1 million copies on the Famicom, Square survived, and an entire genre got its founding text. But if the first game was a miracle of survival, the sequel was a miracle of stubbornness. Final Fantasy II. Most studios would take a hit game and make more of the same. Square did the opposite. Just 1 year after inventing the JRPG, they threw out their own rulebook. Gone were experience points. Completely gone. Instead, Final Fantasy II used a system where your stats grew based on what you actually did in battle. Take a bunch of hits, your HP goes up, cast a ton of spells, your magic improves, swing a sword all day, your strength climbs. It was bold, it was ambitious, and it was absolute chaos to actually play. But the real shift was the story. The anonymous Warriors of Light were replaced by named characters with actual backstories. Furion and his friends are orphans whose parents were killed when the Palametian Empire invaded their homeland. The plot deals with occupation, resistance, and rebellion, themes way heavier than anything the first game touched. And then there's the villain. Emperor Mateus doesn't just want to conquer the world, his endgame is to literally merge hell with the land of the living. In 1988, on the Famicom, nobody saw that coming, and honestly, it's still one of the wildest villain plans in the entire franchise. But if you think that escalation was bold, wait until you see what Square did with the job system next. Final Fantasy III. Here's where Square asked a question that changed RPGs forever. What if you could be everything at once? Final Fantasy III introduced the job system, letting players swap character classes mid-game. Warrior, Mage, Dragoon, you name it. Your party wasn't locked into anything. Every dungeon became a puzzle with dozens of possible solutions depending on how you built your team. But here's the clever part. The story crystals you collect throughout the game are the same things that unlock new job classes. So narrative progression and mechanical progression are literally the same thing. Every story beat makes your party more versatile. And then there's the Onion Knight. It starts as the weakest job in the entire game, borderline useless, but if you grind it long enough, it transforms into the single most powerful class available, a patience tax disguised as a reward. The game became the best-selling title Square had ever produced, and that money funded something massive, the jump from Famicom to Super Famicom, which means the next game had a whole new console to play with, Final Fantasy IV. This is where Final Fantasy stopped being polite and started getting real. Final Fantasy IV introduced the active time battle system, and it changed everything. Instead of each side patiently waiting their turn like a civilized chess match, every character now had their own individual timer filling up in real time. Fast characters could act multiple times before a slow one even got a single swing in. Combat suddenly felt alive, urgent, and genuinely stressful in the best way possible. But the real headline here is Cecil Harvey. He's the first Final Fantasy protagonist with an actual psychological arc. The game opens with him commanding an elite airship squadron and committing war crimes on behalf of a king he's already starting to doubt. That's your hero. And then comes Mount Ordeals. Cecil literally fights a dark copy of himself, and here's the kicker. The way you win is by doing nothing. You have to stop attacking. Every instinct tells you to fight back, but the mechanic demands that you accept your darkness rather than destroy it. The moment you do, Cecil transforms from Dark Knight to Paladin. In 1991, that was genuinely groundbreaking character psychology for a video game. Players clearly agreed. The game went on to sell over 4 million copies worldwide across all its versions, cementing it as one of the most beloved RPGs of the entire Super Nintendo era. But if you think Final Fantasy IV's job was impressive, wait until you see what Final Fantasy V did with the job system. Final Fantasy V. This is the game where the job system hits its absolute ceiling. 22 job classes, all freely switchable at any time. time, and here's the kicker. Mastering one lets you carry its abilities into any other class. Want a knight who can cast black magic? Done. A monk with time magic? Go for it. The system doesn't just allow creativity, it demands it. Two players can fight the exact same boss with completely different party builds and both be right. There is no single correct answer. That design philosophy is exactly why dedicated fans still consider this one of the best in the entire franchise. And then there's X-Death. His goal isn't to conquer the world or reshape it. He wants to erase all of existence using the Void. Just delete everything. For a 1992 Super Famicom game, that's a surprisingly nihilistic motivation. By the final battle, he partially merges with the Void itself, becoming Neo X-Death, a form of chaos so total it transcends the original villain entirely. But if you think erasing reality is dark, wait until you see what Final Fantasy VI's villain actually pulls off. Final Fantasy VI. Every Final Fantasy before this had a main character. One hero, one perspective. Final Fantasy VI threw that out the window. Instead of a single protagonist, the game splits its narrative across roughly a dozen characters, all sharing roughly equal weight in the story. For a console RPG in 1994, that was structurally unheard of. But the real star of this game is the villain. Kefka Palazzo doesn't want to rule the world. He doesn't want to reshape it, he just wants to watch it burn. Zero grand philosophy, zero master plan beyond finding joy in destruction. After a string of villains obsessed with conquest and power, Kefka's pure nihilism hit different. And here's the kicker, he wins. Halfway through the game, Kefka gets his hands on the Warring Triad statues, tears the world apart, and the entire party is scattered across a ruined planet. The second half of the game is spent just trying to regroup. The villain already won, and you're picking up the pieces. Even by modern standards, that's a gutsy narrative move. On the gameplay side, the Esper system let players attach summoned creatures directly to characters, granting magic spells and permanent stat bonuses. Customization wasn't separate from summoning. It was baked right into it. But if Kefka's nihilism felt like the darkest this series could get, Final Fantasy VII was about to prove that the franchise hadn't even scratched the surface of emotional devastation. Final Fantasy VII. This is the one that changed everything. Over 1 million pre-orders in Japan before anyone had even played it. Then it crossed the Pacific and introduced an entire generation of Western players to a genre they'd never touched. For millions of people, this was their first JRPG, and it ruined them for everything else. Midgar alone is worth talking about. The wealthy live on illuminated upper plates, while the poor survive underneath in permanent darkness, crushed beneath a society that runs on stolen life force. Shinra doesn't just control the economy, it drains the planet's actual life energy and converts it into electricity. That environmental storytelling hit hard in 1997. It hits harder now, but here's the thing most people miss. Cloud Strife, your protagonist, is lying to you. Not on purpose. His memory is factually wrong. His identity, his past, none of it is accurate. And unraveling that isn't a subplot, it is the plot. Then there's Sephiroth. The game builds his mythology before you ever see him. You hear stories. You find evidence. By the time he appears, he's already a legend, and the reality turns out to be more tragic than the legend ever suggested. But if you think Final Fantasy VII was the peak, the next entry proved the series wasn't done experimenting. Not even close. Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII didn't just launch, it detonated. Within 2 days of its September 1999 North American release, it became the fastest selling console game in North American history. That record held for weeks, and the hype was justified because this game went places no Final Fantasy had gone before. The big mechanical shakeup was the junction system. Instead of equipping materia or learning spells through leveling, you strapped Guardian Forces directly to your characters, and those summons altered your actual stats. Equip the wrong GF and your party crumbles. Equip the right one and you're untouchable. Every decision had real numerical weight. But here's the thing nobody expected. The game shipped with a card game called Triple Triad, and a massive chunk of the player base spent more time playing cards than saving the world. An entire RPG overshadowed by its own minigame. Honestly, relatable. The villain, Ultimecia, has one of the wildest goals in the franchise. She wants to compress all of time and space into a single moment, with herself at the center of everything. The final dungeon is a psychedelic nightmare of collapsed timelines bleeding into each other, and it's genuinely unlike anything the series had done before. And then there's the ending. Squall gets lost in compressed time, separated from everything. He reunites with Renoa, but the game deliberately refuses to explain how. Whether that reunion is real or a dying fantasy is left completely open. Some players hated it, others called it the boldest ending in the series. Either way, it was a genuine artistic swing. Not sloppy writing. The ambiguity was the point, but if you thought Final Fantasy VIII was a departure, the next entry pulled the series in the complete opposite direction. Final Fantasy IX. After 2 games of sci-fi cities, gunblades, and moody teenagers, Square did something nobody expected. They went backwards. Final Fantasy IX is a deliberate love letter to the series' roots, bringing back medieval kingdoms, black mages in pointy hats, chocobos, and airships front and center. It's the franchise pausing to look in the mirror before leaping into the unknown. The game opens with a theatrical troupe called Tantalus staging a fake kidnapping of a princess. Except the princess actually wants to be kidnapped. So the performance becomes real, and suddenly you're in a story about characters who are constantly aware they're performing. The entire game is obsessed with storytelling, identity, and what it means to play a role, both on stage and in life. Combat runs on the trance system, where characters power up not by dealing damage, but by absorbing it. Get hurt enough, and you enter a temporarily enhanced state. It flips the tension. You're almost rooting for your characters to take hits. But here's the bittersweet part. Final Fantasy IX is the last pure active time battle game in the series. The system that had defined Final Fantasy combat for an entire decade ends here, quietly. Wrapped in nostalgia. It's a farewell disguised as a celebration, and that goodbye was necessary because the next game would change absolutely everything about how Final Fantasy plays. Final Fantasy X. This is where Final Fantasy stopped looking like a video game and started looking like a movie. The jump to PS2 gave the series voice acting, fully cinematic cutscenes, and visual fidelity that made every previous entry look prehistoric overnight. And the story matched that ambition beat for beat. Tidus washes up in Spira with zero clue where he is. Yuna is a summoner walking a pilgrimage that ends in her own ritual death. 2 people moving toward each other from completely different directions, and that tension carries the entire game. The sphere grid replaced traditional leveling with a node map where you physically chart each character's growth path. It's structured enough to not overwhelm you, but flexible enough to let you customize builds. Smart middle ground, and summoned Aeons? They don't just show up for a flashy attack anymore. They replace your entire party when called, turning summons into a real tactical decision about when to swap your whole team out. But here's the gut punch. Breaking the cycle of sin doesn't just save Spira. It erases the dream that Tidus literally is. The heroes win, and the protagonist stops existing. That's the price. If you think losing a hero after the fight is rough, wait until the next entry throws out single player entirely. Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy went online. For the first time in the franchise's history, there was no chosen hero, no pre-written protagonist. Players created their own characters and dropped into a shared world called Vanna DL alongside thousands of other people simultaneously. This was a massive gamble for a series built entirely on single-player storytelling, and it paid off. Here's the thing, Final Fantasy XI didn't just push the franchise forward, it pushed console gaming forward. On June 14th, 2002, the game received the first patch ever deployed to a console game, an online update pushed directly to PlayStation 2 hardware. That sounds routine now. In 2002, that was genuinely groundbreaking infrastructure. The job system returned, but in multiplayer form. Players were encouraged to level multiple jobs because different party compositions demanded different utilities. You couldn't just main one class and expect groups to want you. Social pressure literally shaped how you built your character. And the longevity, over 500,000 total subscribers by July 2007. The final main story scenario didn't even conclude until 2015 through the Rhapsodies of Vanna DL expansion. That's 13 years of continuous narrative, and the game was still running with an active player base in 2026. A 2002 MMO still alive over 2 decades later. That's not just impressive, that's almost unheard of, but if you think taking Final Fantasy Online once was bold, wait until you hear about the time Square Enix tried it again and failed so catastrophically they had to destroy the entire game and rebuild it from scratch. Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII asked a question nobody was ready for. What if you didn't actually play the combat? The Gambit system replaced direct character control with programmable AI logic. You'd set conditional rules for your party, things like if enemy HP below 50%, cast fire, or if ally poisoned, use antidote, and then your team would execute the plan automatically. You were essentially writing code for your party members, and it worked. Beautifully, actually. But it made a lot of players deeply uncomfortable because watching your party fight without you feels wrong even when it's technically brilliant. The story here is notably more mature than anything the series had done before. We're talking resistance movements, colonial occupation, the limits of individual power against historical forces. It's political in a way Final Fantasy rarely attempts. Princess Ashe is trying to reclaim her kingdom from the Arcadian Empire, and she's the real protagonist. Vianna is technically the main character. But let's be honest, he's a tourist. He's just along for the ride, watching Ashe's story happen around him. The license board added another layer of strategy. You could own a sword, but literally not be allowed to swing it without the right license. You had to unlock permission to use your own inventory. The game sold over 1.7 million copies in Japan in its first week alone, proving that even a philosophically uncomfortable combat system couldn't stop people from showing up. But if you think automating combat was controversial, wait until you see what Final Fantasy XIII did to the entire structure of the game. Final Fantasy XIII, this is the one that split the fanbase in half, and honestly, both sides have a point. Final Fantasy XIII introduced the paradigm system, where instead of micromanaging individual commands, you swap your entire party's role configuration mid-fight. 6 roles and success means reading the battle and cycling between setups fast enough to stay alive. It's genuinely clever on paper, but you only directly control the party leader. Everyone else runs on AI, so the system asks you to think strategically while removing your ability to execute strategically. Then there's the story. The Falchi are godlike beings that brand humans as Lyciae, servants forced to complete a mission or slowly transform into monsters. That's the entire thematic core, and most players couldn't explain it without pulling up a wiki. The game buried critical lore and supplementary text logs hidden in the menu. If you didn't read those entries, entire plot points made zero sense. But the biggest criticism? The game is a linear corridor from start to finish. No towns, no NPCs, no shops. The exploration that had defined Final Fantasy since 1987 was stripped out entirely. The paradigm system deserved a better game around it, but if you think 13's linearity was controversial, wait until you hear about a game that launched so broken they literally destroyed the world to fix it. Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV launched in 2010, and it was a disaster. Not a rough around the edges kind of launch, a genuine industry-wide embarrassment. The game was so broken, so fundamentally flawed, that Square Enix made one of the boldest decisions in gaming history. They didn't patch it, they didn't fix it, they decided to burn it to the ground and build an entirely new game from scratch. But here's where it gets insane. Producer Naoki Yoshida and his team kept the original servers running while they built the replacement. Players were still logging in, still playing the doomed version, while behind the scenes, an entirely new game was being constructed. And when it was time to pull the plug, they didn't just shut the servers off. They used the original game's final cutscene to narratively destroy the world, letting players watch the apocalypse happen in real time. The old world ended, the new one began. A Realm Reborn launched in 2013 and became one of gaming's greatest comeback stories. The game went from laughingstock to one of the most praised MMOs ever made. And unlike most MMOs, the story isn't buried in optional lore tabs. You're playing through a main scenario questline with genuine narrative stakes that rival single-player Final Fantasy games. Nearly 13 years later, the Dawn Trail expansion released in 2024, and the game is still growing, still thriving, all because Yoshida prioritized community and accessibility over chasing graphical ambition. If you think that recovery is impressive, wait until you see how messy Final Fantasy XV's journey to release actually was. Final Fantasy XV, this game spent 10 years in development. 10. It started in 2006 as Final Fantasy vs. 13, a side project tied to the 13 universe. But the vision kept changing, the director shifted, the engine changed, and by the time it launched in 2016, it was an entirely different game with an entirely different name. What we got was an open-world action RPG built around the most unexpected structure possible. A road trip, 4 friends, 1 black muscle car, and 0 urgency to save the world anytime soon. You camp at night. Ignis cooks meals. Prompto takes photos. It shouldn't work as well as it does. And here's the thing. The emotional core isn't the prophecy or the politics. It's the friendship between Noctis, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto. The game frames male friendship with a sincerity most action RPGs wouldn't dare attempt. These four genuinely care about each other, and by the end, so do you, which makes the ending hit harder. Noctis has to die. No loophole, no last-minute save. The final campfire scene, where he tries to tell his friends what they mean to him, still destroys people years later, but the game launched incomplete. Significant story beats were locked behind DLC. A companion film was required to understand the opening hours. That undercut what was otherwise one of the most emotionally honest entries in the entire franchise. If you think that's a complicated legacy, wait until you see how the series reinvented itself one more time. Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI doesn't just lean into action, it commits completely. Experience points are gone. Party management is gone. The RPG scaffolding that defined this series for 35 years is stripped away, and what's left is Clive Rosfield, a sword, and some of the most spectacular combat the franchise has ever produced. Here's how it works. Clive fights in real time, and the only way he gets stronger is by absorbing the power of icons, this world's version of summons. But he doesn't just call them into battle, he takes their abilities into himself, letting players chain together multiple icon ability sets in a single fight. You're mixing Phoenix Fire with Garuda Wind with Titan Earth in one combo string. It feels less like a Final Fantasy game and more like a character action game wearing Final Fantasy skin. The story spans multiple time periods, showing Clive at different ages as he transforms from grieving witness to active revolutionary. The opening hours deliberately build a status quo just to destroy it, and the tone is the darkest the series has ever gone. Political violence, slavery, and systemic oppression aren't background details, they're the entire foundation. This earned Final Fantasy its first M rating for a mainline numbered entry in the West. That's not an accident, that's a statement. The result? Multiple Game of the Year nominations, critical acclaim for both its combat and narrative ambition, and DLC expansions like the Rising Tide that proved the game had legs beyond launch. And honestly, that's the whole story of Final Fantasy in one sentence. A series that refuses to be the same thing twice. 15 times now, it's torn itself apart and rebuilt from scratch. And somehow that's always been the point. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.